St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, is known for more than just its sprawling pine forests and scenic bayous. Deeper inland, where the rolling hills gradually give way to vast, marshy flatlands, lies another world, a world of silence and, sometimes, of horrifying secrets. The bayou's bounty, a culinary destination famous among the region's food connoisseurs, was about to become the place where one of those secrets was brought to light. On a late evening at the end of September 2024, after the last diners had departed, the restaurant's kitchen was at its busiest. Chef Antoine, the head chef, along with 2 kitchen hands, was preparing a special batch of python meat, an expensive delicacy pre-ordered by a wealthy client. The main ingredient was a colossal Burmese python, over 10 feet long and weighing nearly 110 pounds, which had just been delivered that afternoon from a familiar reptile farm in a more remote part of the parish. The task of butchering a python is not for the faint of heart. The massive creature lay stretched out on the stainless steel processing table, its beautifully patterned skin now lifeless. With the practiced hands of a veteran chef, Antoine drew a long, sharp blade, making a single, decisive cut down the reptile's belly. The 2 assistants quickly helped him pull back the thick layers of skin and muscle. They began to remove the internal organs. But as Antoine reached into the abdominal cavity, near the stomach, his hand brushed against something very hard with a peculiar shape. It didn't feel like any animal bone he had ever encountered. He muttered to himself, wondering what it was, as he tried to pull the object out. It was quite large and snagged. It took a moment, with the help of an assistant, before he could finally extract it from the python's slimy gut. They placed the object on the table. It was partially corroded by the snake's digestive fluids but still retained its general shape. All 3 men in the kitchen huddled closer to look, and then they all recoiled in unison, their faces pale. It was a bone, but not an animal bone. It had the distinct shape of a human lower leg bone. Though eroded, the joint end and its long, slender form were unmistakable. It was an adult human tibia. The young kitchen hand stammered, his voice filled with terror, identifying it as a human bone. The kitchen fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the whirring of the exhaust fan. A wave of revulsion and horror washed over them. After a moment of stunned shock, Chef Antoine quickly regained his composure. He knew this was no longer a matter for the restaurant. He hurriedly grabbed his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. The news of a human bone being discovered inside a python at a specialty restaurant sent shockwaves through the community. That very night, detectives from the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office arrived and cordoned off the entire restaurant. Captain John Dubois, a seasoned investigator, personally commanded the scene. The bone was carefully sealed as evidence. The entire python carcass was also treated as a crucial piece of evidence. The preliminary forensic report came back early the next morning. It confirmed, definitively, that it was the right tibia of an adult male. The investigation began. The first and only lead at this point was to trace the origin of the python. The owner of the bayou's bounty provided all the necessary information. The python had been purchased from an isolated reptile farm in a rural area of the parish. The farm's owner was a man named Leland Croft. A special task force, led by Captain Dubois himself, immediately set out. After a drive of nearly 2 hours, they found Croft's farm. It was situated in an incredibly remote and isolated location, set in the middle of a vast, open field, several miles from the nearest residential area. The dirt road leading to the farm was narrow and rough. From a distance, they could already smell a strong, foul odor, a pungent, gamey stench characteristic of reptiles. The farm was enclosed by a high, sturdy fence. Inside was a long row of sheds with corrugated metal roofs. When the officers entered, a strange scene greeted them. Dozens of concrete enclosures, covered with wire mesh lids, lined the sheds. Inside each enclosure, a giant Burmese or reticulated python lay coiled silently under a heat lamp. There were more than 20 of them, each over 10 feet long, their bodies as thick as an adult's thigh. They lay there, motionless, but their wide open eyes followed the every move of the strangers, sending a chill down one's spine. Leland Croft, the farm owner, came out to meet the investigators. He was in his 50s, a gaunt, weathered-looking man who appeared every bit the simple, hard-working farmer. He seemed extremely cooperative, but there was an unmistakable anxiety in his eyes that he couldn't hide. Croft greeted the officers, his voice trembling slightly as he asked if there was something he could help them with. Captain Dubois didn't answer immediately. He took a moment to survey the farm. Everything seemed normal, apart from the isolation and the unpleasant smell. Then he got straight to the point, asking Mr. Croft if he had sold a Burmese python to the Bayou's Bounty restaurant a day ago. Croft nodded, confirming that he had, adding that it was the biggest one he owned. Captain Dubois then signaled for a detective to open a case, revealing a clear, clinical photograph of the cleaned human bone, and asked if Croft could perhaps explain why they had found it inside the python's stomach. Upon seeing the photo, Leland Croft's eyes went wide, and the colour drained from his face. He stammered, questioning what it was and how it was possible for it to be a human bone. He played the part of a shocked and bewildered man perfectly. He claimed to know nothing about it. He even offered a theory that sounded outlandish but wasn't entirely impossible. He told the officers that his farm was near a river and that besides chickens and ducks, he sometimes fed the pythons wild rats he caught in the fields. He raised the possibility that the snake might have eaten the remains of someone who drowned in the river, or someone who was secretly buried out in the fields, insisting he honestly knew nothing about it. Croft's explanation put the investigation in a difficult position. They had no direct evidence to implicate him. His theory, however unlikely, had to be considered. The team left the farm, having gained nothing more. But for Captain Dubois, the trip was not in vain. The grim, deathly atmosphere of the farm, the giant pythons with their soulless eyes, and especially the look on Leland Croft's face, a composure that seemed slightly too forced after the initial shock. All of it told the seasoned investigators that this was no random coincidence. This farm was a crime scene, and the simple-looking farmer was very likely a monster. As they got back in their car, Captain Dubois ordered his team to put the farm under immediate 24/7 surveillance. He also instructed them to pull every unsolved missing persons case file in the parish and the surrounding areas from the last few years, stating that he had a feeling this bone was just the tip of the iceberg. The investigation into the human bone found in the python's stomach began with great difficulty. The covert surveillance on Leland Croft's farm yielded no significant results. Every day, Croft repeated the same monotonous routine, cleaning the enclosures, feeding the pythons, and occasionally riding his old pickup truck into town to buy feed. The feed, as observed by the surveillance team, consisted only of sacks of pre-slaughtered ducklings. He lived a reclusive life, rarely interacting with anyone. On the surface, he was a hard-working, somewhat eccentric farmer, showing no signs of being a cold-blooded killer. Meanwhile, the investigation reviewing missing persons cases also hit a dead end. The parish was a large, sparsely populated area with many transient workers and people living off the grid. Over the past few years, there had been a few cases of locals disappearing without a trace, but there were no concrete links to Leland Croft or his python farm. The case seemed to be up against a solid brick wall. Captain Dubois decided to change his strategy. He believed that to understand the man, they had to understand his past. They had to find a turning point, something that could have transformed an ordinary farmer into a monster if his theory was correct. He ordered his detectives to reconstruct Croft's entire life over the past 5 years. As the picture of the past slowly came into focus, one event, a tragic accident that occurred nearly 2 years ago, became a point of special interest. 2 years prior, in late 2022, Leland Croft was not a reclusive loner. He had a hired hand at his farm, a young man named Caleb Boudreau, just in his early 20s. Caleb came from a poor family in the parish. He was gentle, hard-working, and unafraid of the giant pythons. He looked up to Croft like an uncle and was dedicated to his work on the farm. But this was also a time when Croft was facing a major crisis. A local pig farm, which had been his source of cheap feed sick or dead pigs for his pythons, was suddenly hit by a devastating disease outbreak, forcing it to be completely culled and shut down. His main food supply was cut off. Croft was forced to switch to a much more expensive solution, buying ducklings to feed his pythons. 50 ducklings a day, a huge expense that was rapidly draining his meager savings. The underfed pythons also became more aggressive and restless than usual. On one fateful afternoon, Croft had to drive into town to try and borrow money to cover the next feeding. Back at the farm, Caleb was alone, diligently cleaning the enclosures. Tragedy struck at that very moment. Perhaps due to a moment of carelessness, or perhaps because the alpha python was overly hungry and aggressive, Caleb was attacked while cleaning its enclosure. With a lightning-fast coil, The giant python quickly overpowered the young man. When Leland Croft returned, he heard strange noises coming from the sheds. A sense of foreboding washed over him as he rushed over. And then, a horrific scene unfolded before his eyes, a scene that would forever change his life. In the largest enclosure, the alpha python, his most prized animal, was slowly constricting the body of Caleb Boudreaux. The young man was no longer moving, his face was purple, his eyes bulged wide. His life had seemingly been extinguished by the python's terrifying embrace. Croft's first reaction was one of absolute horror. He screamed and grabbed a long pole, intending to rush in and save his employee. But as he reached the enclosure door, he froze. He realized it was too late. Caleb was dead. And confronting a giant, frenzied python was suicide. And then another thought, a thought even more terrifying than the python itself, slithered into his mind. If he called the police now, what would happen? They would come, they would investigate. They would say he failed to ensure workplace safety, that his enclosures were substandard. They would pin all the blame on him. He would go to prison. And the farm, his life's work, would be shut down. He would lose everything. The fear of prosecution, the fear of losing his livelihood, overrode everything else. He made a cruel decision. Instead of reporting the incident, he chose silence. He took a few steps back and slammed the enclosure door shut, latching it carefully. He would let fate run its course. He would turn the python's killing into a missing person case. He stood there, outside the bars, and forced himself to watch the entire spectacle. He watched as the python, certain its prey was dead, began to loosen its coils. Then, it slowly opened its impossibly wide jaws and began to swallow Caleb Boudreaux's body, head first. It was a slow, gruesome, and haunting sight, a human being consumed by another creature. Croft stood there, not looking away for a second, as if mesmerized. He no longer felt fear. Instead, in his twisted mind, a morbid curiosity, a strange fascination, began to rise. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his dark house, the horrific image replaying in his mind. He thought about Caleb, about his death. Then he thought about his pythons. The alpha python was now well fed. It wouldn't need to eat for at least another month. He had just saved a huge amount of money on feed. 50 ducklings a day, the borrowed money, the desperation, and then a demented idea, a solution to all his problems, took root. Humans could also be a source of food. A free, abundant, and nutritious source of food. If just 1 or 2 people disappeared at his farm each month, his feed problem would be solved, and he would never have to worry about money again. The thought was initially just a fleeting spark, but it quickly took root and grew, transforming Leland Croft from a farmer on the brink of bankruptcy, an unwilling witness to a horrific accident, into a monster predator in human form. He had found his way out. The silence following Caleb Boudreaux's death lasted for several weeks. Leland Croft successfully covered up the crime. He told Caleb's family that the boy had stolen some money and run off with a bad crowd. Caleb's family, being poor and without influence, reluctantly accepted the story without suspicion. The farm returned to its usual desolate state. The well-fed alpha python lay dormant in its enclosure, and Croft's financial burden was temporarily lifted. But the monstrous idea born that night did not disappear. On the contrary, it took root and grew in Croft's mind like a poisonous weed. Every day, as he faced the cost of buying ducklings for the remaining pythons, as he watched his last dollars dwindle, the thought resurfaced, urging him on. Humans can be food. A free source of food. At first, he was terrified of his own thoughts, but eventually, the desperation of his circumstances and the corrosion of his conscience won. He was no longer Leland Croft, the simple farmer. He had begun to think like a predator. He needed prey, and the prey had to be the weak, the vulnerable people whose disappearance would not attract much attention. He began to plan. He knew he needed to lure the prey to his farm, a perfect, isolated setting for a crime. He also needed a method to neutralize them quickly and quietly. Sleeping pills were his weapon of choice. On a trip to the city, he visited several rundown pharmacies near the bus station, buying a few powerful sleeping pills at each, lying that he needed them for his sick pigs. With the tools in hand, he began his first hunt. He targeted women who lived alone, those facing hardship, as they were the easiest prey to entice. He handwrote a few simple flyers advertising a need for a farmhand for light cleaning duties, with good pay and included room and board, and posted them at rural markets and on community bulletin boards in neighboring townships. A few days later, a victim took the bait. His first target was a woman named May, a widow in her 30s, struggling to raise a young child in poverty. Seeing the flyer with its attractive salary and the offer of room and board, she sought out Croft's farm without hesitation. Croft greeted her with a gentle, rustic demeanor. He expressed great sympathy for her situation and promised to provide the best possible conditions. He even gave her a cash advance to help her with her child back home, an act that completely won the trust of the desperate woman. The next day, May started her job. The work was indeed not too difficult, mostly cleaning the main house and helping Croft prepare food for the pythons. That evening, Croft prepared a small dinner to welcome his new employee, telling her to make herself at home and that it was nice to have someone to talk to in his lonely life. While May wasn't looking, he secretly slipped a lethal dose of crushed sleeping pills into her iced tea. About 15 minutes after dinner, May began to feel dizzy, then slumped over at the dinner table, unconscious. The crime began. This time, it was not an unwilling observation, it was a deliberate act. Croft felt no fear, only a sick sense of excitement. He dragged May's unconscious body towards the sheds. He chose one of the largest pythons, one that was hungry and extremely aggressive. He opened the enclosure door and, without a moment's hesitation, pushed the woman's body inside. The giant python, sensing the warmth of the prey, immediately stirred. It flicked its forked tongue, tasting the air, and then, suddenly, it struck, wrapping its massive body around the victim. Although May was unconscious, her body still convulsed reflexively a few times in the python's deadly grip. Leland Croft stood outside the bars, silently observing the entire process. He watched the python kill its prey, then patiently watched it open its massive jaws and swallow the victim. He was no longer human. He was a demon, enjoying a performance from hell. The first murder was a perfect success. The disappearance of a poor, widowed woman went unnoticed. People just assumed she had found a better job somewhere far away. A month later, when he needed a new food source, Croft moved on to a different type of target, the town's alcoholics. The next victim was a man named Tone, a homeless man with no family, who spent his days in a drunken stupor. Croft found him loitering at a local tavern and approached him, clapping him on the shoulder. He told the man he looked down and invited him back to his farm for a few glasses of his special snake wine that would warm him right up. Tone, hearing the words free liquor, lit up and happily followed. At the farm, Croft served him wine and snacks, getting him thoroughly drunk. And then, in the final glass, a powerful dose of sleeping pills was mixed in. Tone drank it down and passed out at the table. This time, Croft decided to try a different method. He reasoned that a large prey would take a single python a very long time to digest. If he portioned it, he could feed multiple pythons at once. He dragged Tone's body into a storage shed. He started up his generator, then picked up an old chainsaw he used for cutting firewood. The roar of the chainsaw ripped through the silence of the night, mingling with the gruesome sounds of dismemberment. Afterward, he distributed the body parts among several different python enclosures. For Croft, murder had now become just another part of his animal husbandry routine. He had found a sustainable method to solve his feed problem. His python farm had become a human eating machine. Back in the present, late 2024, Captain Dubois and the Special Task Force, after weeks of work, began to notice a terrifying pattern. Over the past 2 years in St. Tammany Parish, there were nearly 20 unsolved missing persons cases. The victims came from all walks of life but shared one common trait. They were all loners with few social connections, people whose absence wouldn't cause a significant stir. And when the investigators plotted the last known locations of these individuals on a map, a picture emerged. All the red dots clustered together, forming a gruesome circle around a single location, Leland Croft's isolated python farm. Back in the present, late 2024, the atmosphere in the task force's briefing room was incredibly tense. On a large whiteboard, Captain John Dubois and his team had pinned nearly 20 portrait photos. These were the people who had vanished without a trace in St. Tammany Parish and the surrounding areas over the past 2 years. There was a widowed woman who sold vegetables at a market, a homeless alcoholic, a young drifter deep in gambling debt. They had no connection to each other, but they all shared a common thread. They were people on the fringes of society, individuals whose disappearance would not cause much of a stir. And when their last known locations were marked on a map, a horrifying image emerged. The nearly 20 dots formed a circle of death, and at its very center was Leland Croft's isolated python farm. Captain Dubois said, his voice grim, that this could not be a coincidence. He asserted that they were dealing with a serial predator and that his farm was his lair. The problem, he noted, was their lack of direct evidence, as surveillance had turned up nothing unusual, and the suspect was too cunning. He knew that with a clever man like Croft, a direct confrontation without concrete proof would only lead to failure. They needed a crack, a flaw in his perfect facade. The task force decided to change its strategy. Instead of investigating all 20 disappearances simultaneously, they would focus all their resources on the most recent case, where evidence and witnesses' memories might still be fresh. The victim they chose was Ms. Evelyn Reed, a woman in her 50s who lived alone and sold lottery tickets for a living, who had disappeared 2 months ago. Ms. Reed was a kind woman, widely known in her community, so her sudden disappearance had been noticed by many. A special team was assigned the task of reconstructing Ms. Reed's last day. They followed the exact route she used to walk every day, patiently knocking on every door, talking to every person. They worked from dawn till dusk, piecing together every detail, every small memory from those who had interacted with the victim. And then, their persistence paid off. They found an elderly cab driver who often parked at the main intersection in town. When the investigators showed him Ms. Reed's photo, the driver recognized her immediately, referring to her as Evelyn, the lottery lady. He confirmed he remembered the poor woman and had given her her last ride. The investigators' hearts beat faster. They asked him to tell them more, specifically where he had taken her. The cab driver hesitated for a moment, then recounted the story. It was late one afternoon when Ms. Reed flagged him down. She seemed really happy, not like her usual self. She told him she had just gotten a new job cleaning for a farm and that the pay was great, with room and board provided. She asked him to take her out on the old highway, the one that leads out towards the fields. When asked what happened next, the driver continued his account. He drove her out there, and when they got to the dirt road turnoff into the fields, she told him to stop. He noted how desolate it was out there, with no houses or anything. He thought it was strange and asked her what she was doing out there. She just smiled and said the farm owner was coming to pick her up. She paid him a very generous fare and then started walking down that dirt road by herself. He never saw her again after that. That dirt road. The investigators exchanged a look. On their map, it was the only road leading directly to Leland Croft's python farm. The cab driver's testimony became the turning point in the case. It officially placed a missing victim at the very doorstep of the suspect's lair. But to get a warrant for arrest and a search, they needed more corroborating evidence. The team returned to the area. This time, they focused on finding anyone else who might have been in the vicinity of the fields on that fateful afternoon. After days of searching, they found another crucial witness, a farmer whose field was located not too far from the dirt road. The farmer recounted that on that particular afternoon, as he was packing up to go home, he saw Leland Croft's old pickup truck parked at the head of the dirt road. This was unusual, as Croft usually drove a smaller vehicle. A short while later, he saw a woman walk up the road and get into Croft's truck. Because it was getting dark and he was some distance away, he couldn't see the woman's face clearly, only that she seemed to be older. Then, the truck turned around and drove straight towards the farm. The two witnesses' testimonies matched perfectly, creating a solid chain of evidence. They could now prove that the most recent missing victim had gone to Croft's farm and had been with Croft. Croft's theory about the python eating a body that washed ashore was completely debunked. Captain Dubois knew the time was right. He had what he needed to confront the monster. He personally took the entire case file, including the human bone, the map of the 20 disappearances, and, most importantly, the two sworn statements from the key witnesses to the St. Tammany Parish District Attorney's Office. After a thorough review of the evidence, recognizing the extremely serious nature and the undeniable logic of the timeline the task force had reconstructed, the DA's office did not hesitate. A series of crucial legal decisions were approved: an arrest warrant for Leland Croft on the charge of murder, a search warrant for his entire farm, residence, and outbuildings, and, most importantly, an excavation warrant, authorizing investigators to dig anywhere on the property suspected of being a burial or disposal site. The final net was cast. A detailed raid plan was drawn up. Hundreds of police officers were mobilized. They were preparing not just for a standard arrest, but for the possibility of confronting a truth even more horrific than they could imagine. At dawn the next day, a large convoy of police vehicles moved silently along the deserted highway before slowly turning onto the dusty dirt road. The convoy stopped about a mile from Croft's farm. Officers in tactical gear, weapons drawn, quickly disembarked, forming multiple perimeters, secretly closing in on the monster's lair. As the sky began to lighten, the raid began. The SWAT team quickly breached the main gate and swarmed the property. Leland Croft was arrested in his house while he was still half asleep. He was completely taken by surprise but maintained a sullen, silent expression, offering no resistance. After securing the entire area, the comprehensive search began. The task force knew that given the killer's method of disposal, finding intact bodies was nearly impossible. All hope rested on finding forensic evidence at the scene. Captain Dubois' attention was drawn to a large, windowless storage shed. When the shed door was breached, a thick, foul-stench mixture of dried blood, oil, and death assaulted them, causing even the most hardened officers to grimace. Inside was a scene straight out of a slaughterhouse from hell. A large concrete table stood in the middle, next to a generator and an industrial chainsaw caked in dark brown stains. The concrete floor had drainage channels and, despite having been scrubbed, was still covered in suspicious stains. The forensic team immediately went to work. They deployed luminol. When the lights were turned off and the solution was sprayed, the entire shed erupted in a ghostly blue glow. The light was bright on the concrete table, on the blade of the chainsaw, and especially concentrated around the drainage channels. Although the killer had tried to clean meticulously, the blood had soaked too deep the traces could not be erased. The chainsaw, the most crucial piece of evidence, was sealed and taken for special examination. Forensic technicians painstakingly disassembled it, part by part. And just as they suspected, deep within the crevices of the machine, on the chain links, they found countless micro traces of evidence, tiny bits of tissue, minuscule bone fragments, and numerous samples of dried, caked blood things that could never be completely cleaned away. The DNA lab worked around the clock. They began analyzing and extracting DNA from the collected samples. At the same time, the task force urgently collected DNA samples from the relatives of the nearly 20 missing persons. And then, the results started coming in, confirming a horrific truth with scientific certainty. The DNA from the bone found in the python matched the DNA of one of the missing persons. The blood and tissue on the chainsaw blade matched the DNA of Ms. Evelyn Reed, the lottery ticket seller. Not only that, but other samples yielded DNA matches for at least 5 other missing persons on their list. Leland Croft's chainsaw was the ironclad proof, indicting him as a serial murderer. In the interrogation room, Leland Croft maintained his silence, refusing to cooperate. He believed that as long as he didn't confess, the police could do nothing. But when Captain Dubois placed the final forensic report on the table, a report listing the names of 7 victims who had been positively identified via the DNA found on his own chainsaw, Leland Croft's final wall of defense crumbled. Dubois calmly informed Leland that they had found the DNA of at least 7 different missing people on his chainsaw blade and asked if he wanted them to read him their names. Leland Croft stared at the report, his face ashen. He knew any further denial was futile. He had been defeated by the very traces he thought he had erased. He leaned his head back, let out a long sigh, then bowed his head and confessed to everything. His confession was a cold, detailed account of his sick husbandry process. He admitted to killing a total of 19 people over 2 years. All of them had been dismembered in his shed and then fed to his pythons. He saw it as an economic solution, an efficient way of doing business. In the killer's mind, his victims were not human beings. They were just feed. The Python Farm cannibal case shocked the entire nation. The cruelty and inhumanity of the perpetrator were beyond all imagination. At the subsequent trial, the St. Tammany Parish Court sentenced the defendant, Leland Croft, to the highest penalty death for the crime of murder with multiple aggravating circumstances. The sentence was pronounced, but the haunting legacy of the case will remain forever. Leland Croft's python farm was sealed and demolished. The pythons were later euthanized and incinerated. But the horrifying story became a dark legend in the region. 20 lives were senselessly taken. 20 families were left to grieve for their loved ones. never knowing that they had been erased from this world in the most silent and gruesome way imaginable. This case shows how terrifyingly thin the line between man and monster can be. From a single moment of fear and guilt, an ordinary person took one long slide into depravity, transforming into a demon devoid of all humanity.